Hi there. You're here because you're either into history, into sleep, or just tired of the algorithm recommending videos titled Top 10 Epic Kills in Assassin's Creed. Whatever brought you here, welcome. Now do yourself a favor, lie back, get comfortable, maybe dim the lights. Maybe pull your blanket up like you're hiding from medieval tax collectors, because tonight we're slipping quietly, very quietly, into the shadowy world of medieval assassins. Not the cool, slow-motion Parker and Leather assassins. No, the real ones. The miserable ones. The ones with bad shoes, worse pay, and zero chance of a retirement plan. If you've ever thought, wow, I could have been a cool rogue back then, you might want to reconsider. Because being a medieval assassin wasn't some stealthy, noble calling. It was more like a last-ditch survival strategy with extra stabbing. More hiding in pig stables than sneaking on rooftops. So close your eyes. Take a deep breath. Ignore that creaky floorboard. It's probably just your cat. Probably. And let's take a slow, whisper-soft walk through a time when silence was deadly, shadows were currency, and absolutely everything smelled like goats. Ready? Good. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Expectations versus reality. So you want to be a medieval assassin. Medieval assassins. Silent, swift, mysterious, cloaked in shadows. Leaping off towers, landing in hay bales that somehow break the fall but not your spine. Yeah, that version. Thanks, video games. But here's the thing. If you were actually alive back then, and someone called you an assassin, it probably meant you smelled like moldy bread, hadn't bathed in weeks, and were one poor decision away from being boiled in oil. Let's burst the fantasy bubble right now, because being an assassin in medieval times wasn't some glamorous side hustle. It wasn't cool. It wasn't clever. It sucked, quietly, dangerously, and often fatally. See, the myth goes like this. You train in a hidden mountain monastery. You master the blade, learn pressure points, study poisons, maybe even develop a smoldering gaze that kills before your dagger does. The reality? You're a half-starved ex-soldier who knows how to climb a fence without sneezing. Maybe. Training? You got it on the job. By which we mean you survived the first attempt. Congrats. Now you're qualified. Kinda. You didn't have scrolls of ancient wisdom. You had a rusty knife, a good sense of direction, and a deep hope that the guards were drunk. And you weren't taking out cartoon villains either. It wasn't stab the evil wizard and ride off into the mist. It was more like, please eliminate Lord What's-His-Name, who lives in a stone fortress, has 12 guards, 3 dogs, and a moat full of suspicious-looking eels. Also, he sleeps in a rotating bedchamber and hasn't trusted soup since 1342. Good luck. And let's not forget, assassins weren't hired by kings. They were hired by angry nephews, by scheming uncles, by bishops with way too much gold and not enough morals. And the pay? Well, it was silver, in theory. More often you got half the coins up front, and the other half never happened because your client mysteriously vanished the moment you finished the job. So yeah, the fantasy was all sleek robes and slow-motion backflips. The reality? Itchy wool, constant paranoia, and a very real chance that the only legacy you'd leave behind was a bloodstain and some confused chickens. But before we get deeper into the muddy, miserable shoes of a medieval hitman, spoiler, they're damp, always. Let's figure out where this whole assassin thing even came from. Because surprise, it's not what you think. Origins. Not exactly a career choice. The word assassin itself has a pretty weird history. It comes from Hashashins, or more accurately, Hashashin, which many people think means hashish users. However, modern historians believe this was actually a derogatory term applied by their enemies, not what they called themselves. The term was first used around 1122 when a Fatimid caliph used it as a pejorative for his Syrian rivals. It didn't actually mean they were using drugs. It was more like calling them outcasts or rabble. The whole drugged-up killer myth was largely invented by European travelers who had no idea what they were talking about. But hey, it made for good stories. The actual group that inspired these legends? They were the Nizari Ismailis, a sect of Shia Islam that formed in the late 11th century during a dispute over who should lead the Fatimid Caliphate. And you thought your workplace drama was bad. They set up a network of mountaintop fortresses throughout Persia and Syria, with their main headquarters at Alamut, the famous Eagle's Nest. From there, they did occasionally engage in targeted killings, but it wasn't exactly their full-time job. These weren't random murders either. They were calculated political moves against specific leaders who posed threats to their community. And despite what legends say, they weren't high on hashish when doing it. The not-so-glamorous daily life. So what was life actually like for the average assassin? Well, if you were a member of the Nizari Ismailis living in one of their fortresses, you weren't spending your days practicing backflips and poison brewing. Life inside Alamut was primarily focused on scholarship, devotion, and community. The fortress housed an impressive library, and residents studied theology, philosophy, astronomy, and other subjects. You were more likely to be reading books than stabbing people. But let's say you were one of the few selected for the more hands-on political work. What then? Well, you'd be called a fidai, meaning self-sacrificing one. Not a great job title if you're hoping to retire someday. Training wasn't just physical. You'd need to learn different languages, cultures, and customs to blend into various social settings. No fancy special effects, just the boring hard work of becoming someone else. Your workspace wouldn't be some cool secret lair with trapdoors. Your primary weapon was a simple dagger, and your method was usually a straightforward, if difficult, fatal stabbing to the chest. To do this, you had to get very close to your target. Close enough to smell their probably not great medieval breath. And speaking of smells, personal hygiene in medieval times? Not great. Bathing was rare. Your cool assassin outfit? You'd be dressed as a civilian, monk, or servant. Anything that wouldn't raise suspicion. No special hood with eagle designs. No custom-fitted leather armor. Just whatever would help you blend in with the smelly masses. The occupational hazards. The job security? Terrible. The health insurance? Non-existent. The retirement plan? Don't make me laugh. Most missions were expected to be one-way trips. If you succeeded, great. You might make it back alive. If you failed, well, medieval justice wasn't known for its mercy or fair trials. Being an assassin required physical strength, weapon skills, and education to understand other cultures and speak multiple languages. But most importantly, it required accepting that you were probably going to die in a really unpleasant way. The reality of the job was constant stress, horrible working conditions, and almost certain death. No wonder so many assassins were described as fanatically devoted. You'd have to be to accept those terms of employment. Famous successes. That probably got someone killed. Some assassinations did change history, which is probably the only positive job review these poor souls ever got. One of the most famous victims was Nizam al-Mulk, a Persian vizier to the Seljuk court, killed in 1092 by an assassin disguised as a Sufi mystic. It was a political hit that shook the region, but also likely resulted in brutal retaliation against anyone suspected of involvement. Another notable target was Conrad of Montferrat, who was assassinated days before he was to be crowned king of the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1192. Imagine ruining your chance at retirement benefits just to stop some guy from getting a fancy hat. Even the mighty Saladin, who conquered most of the Crusader states, wasn't immune. He survived 2 assassination attempts, but was reportedly so terrified afterward that he negotiated a truce with the Nizaris. According to legend, he woke up one night to find hot scones by his bed with a note pinned by a poisoned dagger. basically saying, "We could have killed you while you slept." Talk about a midnight snack with a message. Tools of the trade, less arsenal, more whatever's handy. Forget the exotic weaponry you've seen in games. The primary weapon was a simple dagger. Why? Because it was easy to hide, and you could get close to your target without raising suspicion. Other weapons had to be easily concealed or disguised as ordinary tools. Poison was sometimes used, but administering it was tricky. Your target might raise the alarm before succumbing. There were no smoke bombs, no spring-loaded hidden blades, no specialized climbing equipment. You had a knife, your wits, and maybe a rope if you were lucky. Fashion choices, functional, not fashionable. That stylish hood with the pointy beak, pure fiction. Before an assassination, you'd be dressed as a civilian, monk, or servant. Any disguise that wouldn't draw attention. No custom-tailored outfits with special insignias. No color-coordinated capes that somehow stay clean while you're crawling through medieval streets, which, by the way, were basically open sewers. You wore what helped you blend in, period. And blending in medieval times meant looking and smelling just as dirty and desperate as everyone else. The end of an era, no dramatic final stand. The legendary assassins didn't even get a heroic ending. In 1256, the Mongols, led by Hulagu Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson, attacked Alamut. The fortress fell, and with it, the power of the Nizari Ismaili state. Their famous library was burned, their leaders killed or captured, and just like that, the era of the assassins was over. Not with a dramatic last stand or a phoenix-like rebirth, just conquest by a bigger, stronger force. The aftermath, from history to legend. After their defeat, the actual history of the Nizari Ismailis was largely lost or distorted. The assassins' library was destroyed when their fortress fell, so most of what we know comes from their enemies or from exaggerated European accounts. This information vacuum allowed the legend to grow wilder with each retelling. Marco Polo's famous account, written decades after the fall of Alamut, described a mystical old man of the mountain who used drugs and beautiful women to trick young men into becoming killers. Pure fiction, but incredibly sticky as far as myths go. By the time European writers got hold of the story, the assassins had transformed from a small religious community using targeted violence for survival into supernatural killers with mystical powers. And that's the version that stuck. So you still want to be a medieval assassin? If you're still set on the idea after all this, well, I can't help you. The original assassins are long gone, their fortresses ruins, their techniques lost to history. But maybe that's for the best, because the reality wasn't glamorous missions and cool gadgets, it was desperation, fear, and sacrifice. The fantasy might involve dramatic leaps of faith and heroic struggles against corruption. The reality was just people trying to survive in a violent world, using the limited tools they had. So maybe keep the fantasy where it belongs, in games and movies. After all, virtual hay bales are much more forgiving than real ones, and digital guards never smell like medieval body odor. But if you absolutely insist on living the assassin lifestyle, maybe start with some basic fence climbing, and invest in good shoes. Because if there's one thing medieval assassins knew for sure, it's that uncomfortable footwear makes for a miserable last day on Earth. Chapter 2. A Day in the Life of a Medieval Assassin. You wake up and instantly regret it. Morning, the hour of regret. You wake up in a pile of straw, not a cozy storybook straw bed, actual straw, on the ground, in a storage shed behind a tavern that doesn't know you're there. Or maybe it does, and the bartender just pities you. Your back hurts. Something small and furry scurries away under your blanket, which, by the way, is just an old horse blanket you found 3 towns ago. You're cold, always cold, and now it's time to get up. In medieval times, sleep wasn't the 8-hour luxury we now expect. Like many people of your era, you probably slept in 2 phases. A first sleep until around midnight, Then a wakeful period where you might pray, think, or just stare at the darkness, followed by a second sleep until dawn. But as an assassin, your sleep was even more fragmented, punctuated by startling awake at every creak and rustle. Unlike nobles with their feather beds and canopies, or even respectable peasants with decent pallets in their homes, you make do with whatever hidden corner you can find. Sometimes it's a pile of hay in a barn. Sometimes it's curled beneath a hedgerow outside town. On special occasions, it might be a rented attic space. Luxury. First things first, stretch. Except don't. Because stretching makes your shoulder pop weird ever since you fell off that second-floor balcony in Dunstow. Instead, you slowly sit up and listen. Is the street quiet? Any dogs barking? Any guards yelling, "There he is"? No? Good. That's a win. You learned early in this profession that being alive each morning counts as success. The daily ritual begins with assessing your surroundings, a habit that has kept you breathing longer than most in your line of work. Your senses are heightened from years of having to detect danger before it detects you. Next, hygiene. You go to the nearest water source, which is a communal well, where you splash exactly 3 handfuls of ice-cold water on your face. There's no soap, no toothpaste. You rub your teeth with your cloak. It does nothing. Some people here think bathing too often makes you sick anyway, so really you're just fitting in. Truth be told, you're actually cleaner than most folks in this age. While nobility might have occasional access to proper baths with heated water and even visit public bathhouses in larger towns, most peasants wash infrequently. Your profession, however, sometimes requires blending in with better society, so you make more effort than the average person. You have a small cloth and a bit of lye soap wrapped in oiled leather, saved for when you need to look presentable. Today isn't that day. You check your gear, a dagger slightly bent, a vial of something that might be poison or might just be wine vinegar, a rope, frayed. Your shoes are damp. Again, they've been damp for so long, you've started calling them the swamps. Unlike the fantasy assassins of games and stories, your weapons are neither ornate nor particularly special. The dagger was stolen from a drunk soldier 2 years ago. The rope is common hempen cord, useful for climbing or strangulation in a pinch. The vial contains a concoction you purchased from an old woman who claimed it would stop a man's heart. You've never tested it to find out if she was telling the truth. Your real weapons are patience, observation, and anonymity. Flashy killing tools would only mark you as suspicious. Better to use common items that raise no alarms. A cooking knife, a woodsman's axe, or even a well-placed shove on a steep staircase. Breakfast, sustenance of champions. You don't exactly have food, but you do have a stale crust of bread that's somehow harder than the cobblestones outside. You chew it slowly while watching a rat eat something you really hope wasn't cheese. Breakfast in medieval times isn't the elaborate meal modern people imagine. For most, it's a simple affair. Perhaps bread and ale for common folk, maybe with cheese if they're fortunate. For the poorest, it might be a thin porridge of whatever grain is cheapest. You eat what you can find or afford, which isn't much on the meager, unpredictable income of your profession. If you're lucky, you'll pass through a marketplace later, maybe swipe an apple, maybe steal a meat pie, maybe get chased by a very angry pie vendor with a cleaver. Again, while thievery isn't your primary trade, survival often requires supplementing your income with petty theft. You're careful about it, though. A minor offense like stealing food could expose you to the authorities and lead to questions you'd rather not answer. You wrap your few possessions and tuck them into a small sack that you can carry inconspicuously. Nothing about you should look unusual. Your clothes are deliberately ordinary. Plain woolen tunic, simple linen undergarments, a leather belt, and those perpetually damp shoes. You wear a hood when needed, but it's nothing special. Just a typical covering that many travelers or workers might use against the weather. Your most expensive possession is a small knife with a whetstone, kept not for killing but for everyday tasks. In a world where most people carry some kind of blade for eating and working, It would be more suspicious to be without one. Midday. Work. Most people your age are working in fields, hammering horseshoes, or praying they don't catch the plague. You, though, you have a job, kind of. Tonight, you're supposed to eliminate a merchant who's been skimming gold from the wrong noble's tax collection. But right now, you're casing the area. That means walking around slowly, trying not to look like someone planning a murder. This is the real work of an assassin, not dramatic roof running or elaborate sword fights, but the careful, boring observation of patterns and routines. You need to know when the merchant leaves his home, who accompanies him, which guards change shifts, and when, which windows might be unlocked, which servants might be bribed or avoided. You glance at guard patrols. You count windows. You find out where the servant entrance is. You also learn that the merchant has a dog, a very loud dog. Perfect. Animals are often the greatest challenge in your work. They can't be bribed, reasoned with, or easily silenced. Dogs especially have ruined more carefully laid plans than any human guard. You make a mental note to bring a bit of drugged meat if you can acquire some. The sun's getting hotter, and your cloak is sticking to your back. Wool. Terrible idea. But it's the only thing you have that doesn't scream, "Please search me, I'm armed and full of secrets." Medieval clothing isn't designed for comfort. The wool is itchy and heavy, but it's durable and keeps you warm at night. Your boots, while perpetually damp, protect your feet on rough roads and streets caked with mud, animal waste, and garbage. People of this era don't have the luxury of clothing specifically designed for different activities. Your work attire is the same as your sleeping attire, just arranged more carefully. You find a tavern and order a small ale, which is safer to drink than the water and gives you a reason to sit and listen. Taverns are information goldmines. People talk, guards relax, servants gossip. You keep your head down, ears open, and comments minimal. An unremarkable presence is your greatest disguise. Afternoon. Waiting. You find a quiet spot near the target's house. You wait. You nap a little, leaning against a barrel that smells like fermented sadness. A fly buzzes near your ear for 20 straight minutes. The dog keeps barking. You're starting to hate this dog. Deeply, philosophically, the medieval world moves slowly, especially for someone in your profession. There are no watches to synchronize, no precise schedules. You judge time by the movement of the sun, the ringing of church bells, and the general flow of activity around you. This imprecision makes timing a kill particularly challenging. Your target might follow routine, but he usually visits the tavern after evening prayers, could mean any time within a 2-hour window. While waiting, you rehearse your approach mentally. You consider contingencies. What if the door is barred? What if there are unexpected guests? What if you're spotted? Each scenario requires a different response, a different escape route. Unlike the heroic assassins of fiction, your primary concern isn't making the kill but surviving afterward. Eventually, the merchant leaves for the tavern. You trail behind him, keeping your distance, stepping where the street is dry and avoiding the suspicious puddles that might be rain or something worse. Medieval streets are filthy by modern standards. In smaller towns, they're simply packed earth, rutted by cartwheels and hoof prints, turning to mud after rain. In larger cities, some main streets might be cobbled, but trash and human waste are common hazards. Drainage systems, if they exist at all, are primitive. The stench would overwhelm modern sensibilities. But to you and everyone else living in this time, it's just the background smell of existence. At the tavern, you sit in a dark corner, pretending to be a carpet seller. You nod politely. You sip bad ale. You try not to draw attention. This is your skill, being forgettable. The merchant leaves. You follow. It's almost time. Evening. The sun dips. The shadows stretch. Your heart rate picks up. Not from fear, but from the 3 flights of stairs you just climbed to reach the merchant's rooftop window. Medieval buildings aren't standardized. Some have wide, accessible windows. Others are little more than arrow slits. Some are secured with wooden shutters, others with expensive glass panes, and the richest might have iron grills for protection. You've studied this particular window for days, noting that it's left open in the evening to cool the upper room before the merchant retires for the night. You creep inside, silent, careful. You hear breathing. The merchant is asleep. This is the moment where fiction diverges most sharply from reality. There will be no dramatic confrontation, no announcement of your presence, no chance for the merchant to beg or bribe. A successful assassination is one where the target never knows what happened. Quick, quiet, and above all, final. You reach for your dagger. You pause. Because this is where everything either works or goes very, very wrong. 1 breath. 2. Strike. It's done. Quiet. Quick. You don't linger. You vanish through the servants' hallway and out into the night, back into the maze of alleys and smells and distant torchlight. A professional like you doesn't stop to verify the kill with elaborate rituals or leave calling cards. The client will know soon enough if the job is done. Your priority now is to disappear into the darkness, to become just another shadow in a world lit only by fire. You're alive. For now. Night. Aftermath. You head to the meeting spot, a cellar below a wine shop. Your contact doesn't show. Of course. You wait an hour. Eventually a stranger appears. They hand you a small pouch of coins. You open it. It's less than promised. Much less. You say nothing. You nod. You leave, because arguing means attention, and attention means dead. The economics of your profession are as murky as the ethics. Payment is never guaranteed, amounts are rarely fixed, and there's no guild to enforce fair treatment. Your employers know you can't exactly take them to court for shorting you on a murder fee. Still, most pay reasonably well, not because they're honest, but because they may need your services again and don't want to be the next target. The coins you've received aren't standardized currency as in modern times. Medieval money is a confusing mix of various kingdoms' coins, each with different metals and values. Some might be clipped or shaved, reducing their worth. You'll need to find a money changer tomorrow, someone discreet who won't ask where a person of your apparent status acquired such coins. You don't go home. You find another abandoned shed or an attic or a pile of hay behind a barn. You lie down, fully clothed, dagger tucked under your sleeve. Because sleep isn't peace. It's just recharging until the next mess. In your line of work, habits are deadly. Returning to the same sleeping spot would be foolish, especially after completing a job. While the merchant's death might be discovered as murder rather than natural causes, you've left nothing to connect yourself to the scene. Still, prudence dictates moving to a different part of town, or even leaving entirely if the job was high profile enough. You stare at the wooden beams above you. You think of nothing. You let the dark take over, and maybe, just maybe, you dream of a world with socks that aren't damp. But probably not. Dreams are for people with futures. For you, sleep is just the brief respite between one day of survival and the next. Behind the fantasy, the modern imagination loves to romanticize the medieval assassin, the black-clad figure leaping from rooftops, the master of exotic weapons, the silent killer with a complex moral code. The reality, as with most historical professions, was far more mundane and far more desperate. Most assassins weren't part of elaborate secret orders with training facilities and mysterious rituals. They were typically former soldiers, criminals, or simply desperate individuals with a particular talent for violence and discretion. Some might have learned their skills in army service, others through the harsh education of survival on medieval streets. The most successful assassins weren't those with the most impressive killing techniques, but those who understood the value of patience, planning, and above all, anonymity. The assassin who becomes famous quickly becomes dead. Your methods are practical rather than flashy. Why use an exotic poison when a simple knife will do? Why develop elaborate fighting techniques when attacking a sleeping victim is far more reliable? Your training wasn't in some mountain monastery, but in the cruel classroom of experience, where failures rarely got second chances. The historical Nizari Ismailis, often cited as the origin of the term assassin, did operate as a more organized entity, but even their methods were more about strategic elimination of key enemies than the superhuman feats depicted in modern media. They used careful planning, disguise, and the element of surprise, much like you do. You have no grand philosophy about your work. It's simply what you know how to do. A skill set that keeps you fed when farming or trade or soldiering weren't options. In a world with few social safety nets and little upward mobility, killing for hire is just another service in a harsh economic landscape. As you drift into sleep, you don't ponder the morality of your actions or dream of redemption. Those are luxuries for people who haven't seen the underside of medieval existence, who haven't learned that in a world of plagues, wars, and famine, death comes in many forms, and you're simply one of them. Tomorrow, if you survive the night, you'll begin again. The endless cycle of hiding, watching, waiting, and striking. The life of a medieval assassin isn't glorious, but then again, very few lives in this age are. And at least you're still breathing, for now. Chapter 3. The Dark Side of Civilization. Spoiler, it was mostly darkness. If the day-to-day life of a medieval assassin sounded rough, well, welcome to the rest of medieval society. Because in the grand pyramid of suffering, assassins were just one sad brick among many. Let's dim the candlelight even further and take a soft, miserable stroll through the darker corners of the so-called civilized world. Fair warning, it's about to get historically uncomfortable. But don't worry. I'll keep the tone light, the facts real, and the volume sleep-friendly. Death, disease, and the delicate art of dying horribly. Let's start with the obvious. You are going to die. Not in a poetic fade into the sunset way. More like, he caught something from a bucket and exploded kind of death. Plague? Common. Dysentery? Daily. Infected blisters from your ill-fitting shoes? Oh, absolutely. And medicine? Well, medieval doctors were basically herbalists with ambition. If something was wrong, they'd probably bleed you, rub garlic on the wound, blame the moon, or suggest prayer. Sometimes all four. Did it help? Not really. But it gave everyone something to do before you died anyway. Medieval medicine wasn't simply ineffective, it was often counterproductive. Based on ancient concepts from Galen and other classical physicians, it operated on a humoral theory where illness resulted from imbalances in four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. This theory led to treatments that often worsened a patient's condition rather than improving it. The most infamous example was bloodletting, a universal remedy based on the notion that excess blood caused everything from fevers to melancholy. Physicians would cheerfully drain significant amounts of blood from already weakened patients, using everything from primitive knives called fleams to specially bred medicinal leeches. It wasn't uncommon for patients to receive multiple bloodlettings during a single illness, further depleting their strength at a time when they needed it most. For wounds and external injuries, treatments weren't much better. While some herbal remedies did contain compounds with mild antiseptic properties, they were often applied alongside substances like animal dung or toxic compounds that introduced new infections. One advanced technique for treating deep wounds involved packing them with lint soaked in wine, which might have provided some minimal antiseptic benefit, only to seal them with mixtures containing ingredients like egg white and honey that created perfect environments for bacterial growth. When the Black Death arrived in the 14th century, it revealed how desperately inadequate medieval medicine truly was. Physicians had no concept of contagion as we understand it today, instead attributing the plague to everything from bad air, miasma theory, to astrological alignments to divine punishment. Some even blamed it on Jewish communities, leading to horrific persecutions. The most sophisticated medical advice suggested burning aromatic herbs, wearing pomanders filled with spices, or applying a paste of dried toads to the buboes, none of which addressed the actual bacterial infection or its transmission by flea bites. Even the so-called medical experts of the day were shockingly limited in their knowledge. University-trained physicians rarely performed physical examinations, instead diagnosing by examining urine samples in special glass flasks, feeling the pulse, or simply looking at a patient from across the room. Surgery was considered a lower-class trade, performed by barber surgeons whose expertise in cutting hair apparently qualified them to amputate limbs and extract bladder stones. To make matters worse, cities were crowded, sanitation was non-existent, and public health officials were, let's say, more concerned with sin than sewage. So if you weren't dying from a sword wound, you might still go out from soup. Consider the living conditions that incubated disease in medieval cities. Streets were open sewers where households dumped waste directly from windows, often with little more warning than a hastily shouted, "Guard is low! Watch out for the water!" Butchers slaughtered animals in central markets, letting blood and offal run into the same streets where children played, and vendors sold uncovered food. Public wells were frequently contaminated by nearby cesspits, spreading waterborne pathogens throughout entire neighborhoods. During the 13th and 14th centuries, some cities began implementing rudimentary public health measures. Venice created one of the first quarantine systems during plague outbreaks, isolating ships and travelers in a designated area. The term quarantine comes from the Italian quaranta giorni, or 40 days, the length of the isolation period. Many towns hired gong farmers to remove waste from cesspits under cover of darkness, though they usually just dumped it into the nearest river, which also served as a source of drinking water. Even basic personal hygiene was challenging. Despite the popular misconception that medieval people never bathed, many cities had public bathhouses and personal cleanliness was valued. However, the lack of running water, soap, which existed but was expensive, and an understanding of microbial contamination meant that even regular bathing provided limited protection against disease. And if all this wasn't enough to test your survival skills, there was the constant risk of famine. A single bad harvest could, and frequently did, bring entire regions to the brink of starvation. Climate fluctuations like the medieval warm period, roughly 950, 1250 CE, and the Little Ice Age, beginning around 1300 CE, created agricultural instability that modern farmers with their technology, understanding of crop science, and global supply chains would find hard to imagine. Justice, but make it loud crime? Sure, it existed. Justice? Also, in a way. Let's say you got caught stealing a loaf of bread. Best case? Stocks. You sit in public while children throw vegetables at your face. Worst case? Amputation, branding, hanging, or being questioned until you confess to everything, including things you didn't do. Like cursing the bishop's cat. Trials were flexible. Evidence was less important than vibes. And if you were a foreigner, looked weird, or were too quiet, bad luck. Medieval justice operated on principles that would horrify modern legal minds. Guilt or innocence often depended less on evidence and more on one's standing in the community. The concept of compurgation allowed accused persons of good reputation to be cleared if they could find enough respected community members, compurgators, willing to swear to their innocence, not based on any knowledge of the facts, but simply on their belief in the accused's character. Conversely, strangers to a community, those with previous accusations, or individuals with unpopular religious or political views faced immediate disadvantages. For particularly serious or ambiguous cases, many courts resorted to trial by ordeal, a practice that persisted well into the 13th century. The accused might undergo trial by fire, carrying a red-hot iron bar, trial by water, being bound and thrown into a lake, or trial by combat, fighting their accuser or a champion. These ordeals were not merely tests of endurance, but were considered appeals to divine judgment. A wound that healed cleanly after a fire ordeal indicated innocence. Floating rather than sinking in water suggested guilt, as pure water would reject a sinful body. Physical punishment permeated the medieval justice system. Minor offenses might result in the pillory or stocks, wooden frames that locked offenders in place for public humiliation. This wasn't just embarrassing. It could be deadly in extreme weather, or if a hostile crowd decided to throw stones rather than rotten vegetables. For more serious crimes, mutilation served both as punishment and permanent marking of criminals. Thieves might lose hands, counterfeiters their fingers, perjurers their tongues. Branding burned permanent marks into the flesh of offenders, ensuring they carried visible evidence of their crime for life, effectively preventing them from ever reintegrating into society or finding legitimate work. If you were an assassin who got caught, that's when the real creativity began. Racks, Iron Maidens, wheels, firearm, and very enthusiastic crowds who brought snacks. Death sentences varied in brutality based on the nature of the crime and the social status of the condemned. Nobles generally received the relatively merciful beheading, while commoners faced hanging. But for crimes considered especially heinous, treason, heresy, or witchcraft, execution methods became tools of extended suffering and public spectacle. Traitors to the crown might be hanged, drawn, and quartered, partially strangled, disemboweled while still conscious, and then dismembered, with their body parts displayed publicly as warnings. Burning at the stake was reserved primarily for heretics and witches, the flames symbolically purifying society of the condemned's spiritual corruption. Even ordinary executions were elaborate public events, sometimes scheduled on market days when the largest crowds would be present. The condemned would be paraded through the streets, given a chance to address the crowd and hopefully confess, and then dispatched before a jeering audience. Families might fight over the corpse's possessions, or even parts of the body itself, which were believed to have magical properties, especially from executed criminals. The justice system also varied dramatically depending on where you lived. In feudal territories, local lords had enormous latitude in administering justice within their domains, creating a patchwork of legal severity and leniency. Urban areas developed their own codes and courts, sometimes more systematic but often no less harsh. Ecclesiastical courts handled cases involving clergy or matters of religion, adding another layer to an already complex and often arbitrary system. Religion and other everyday fears. Medieval religion wasn't all soft hymns and candlelight. It was powerful, controlling, and frankly a bit terrifying. People believed the devil was real, that sin could rot your body, and that sneezing without crossing yourself might send your soul directly to eternal barbecue. Churches told people how to live, how to dress, what to eat, and when to feel guilty. Spoiler, it was always time to feel guilty. Medieval Christianity permeated every aspect of daily life in ways modern people can scarcely comprehend. It wasn't merely a matter of personal belief or Sunday observance, but the lens through which people understood the universe, their place in it, and every natural phenomenon around them. The church calendar structured the year with religious festivals, fasts, and feasts. Every significant life event, birth, marriage, illness, death, involved religious ritual. Even concepts of time revolved around religious observance. Daytime hours were marked by church bells calling the faithful to prayer 8 times daily. People might not have owned clocks, but they knew exactly when prime, terce, or vespers should be observed. The church's authority extended far beyond spiritual matters. Parish priests were often the only literate individuals in rural communities, making them the interpreters of not just religious but also legal and political directives. Ecclesiastical courts claimed jurisdiction over a wide range of offenses, from enforcing marriage contracts to punishing moral transgressions like adultery. Many crimes were simply acts the church deemed sinful, blurring the line between legal and religious authority. The medieval mindset viewed the natural and supernatural worlds as deeply interconnected. Illness wasn't just a bodily affliction, but potentially a spiritual one as well, caused by sin or demonic influence. Crops failed not merely because of weather, but because a community had angered God. Unusual weather events, from lightning strikes to comets, were interpreted as divine messages rather than natural phenomena. This worldview centered around a cosmology where every soul faced judgment, with the agonies of hell vividly depicted in church art and sermons. The torments awaiting sinners weren't abstract concepts, but terrifyingly specific punishments corresponding to particular sins, portrayed in gruesome detail on church walls, where even the illiterate could read their fate if they strayed from the righteous path. Assassins, of course, didn't rank high on the heavenly guest list. Killing people for coin, very much frowned upon. Unless it was a crusade, then suddenly it was fine. Double standards, medieval edition? The inconsistency in how the church treated violence reveals much about medieval society's power structures. While commissioning a murder would condemn one's soul to eternal torment, killing Muslims during crusades earned spiritual indulgences that reduced one's time in purgatory. A baron executing peasants for poaching on his land was merely exercising his God-given authority, while those same peasants killing the baron's deer to feed starving families committed not just a crime, but a sin against the divinely ordained social hierarchy. Even within religious community, fear was a constant companion. The early medieval period saw the rise of penitentials, essentially sin catalogues that prescribed specific penances for transgressions. These manuals categorized sins with legalistic precision, establishing hierarchies of wrongdoing from venial, minor, to mortal, soul-damning. Priests used these texts to assign penances ranging from simple prayers to years of fasting or pilgrimages for those who confessed their sins. Superstition was everywhere. If your cow died unexpectedly, witch. If your bread didn't rise, witch. If you had a weird birthmark and didn't talk much, definitely a witch, or a demon, or both. Or if you were lucky, just an assassin in disguise. The witch hunts that would later devastate communities during the early modern period had their roots in medieval attitudes toward the unexplained. While the sophisticated theological discussion of demonology emerged primarily in the late medieval era, the popular belief in maleficium, harmful magic, existed throughout the period. People believed certain individuals could curse cattle, cause impotence, spoil crops, or bring illness through supernatural means. Women were particularly vulnerable to such accusations, especially those who lived alone, practiced folk medicine, or behaved in ways that challenged community norms. Midwives, who worked with the dangerous and often mysterious process of childbirth, could find their reputations and lives at risk if too many infants died under their care. The boundaries between accepted folk remedies and suspicious magical practices were dangerously blurry. Even everyday objects carried supernatural significance. Doors and windows needed protection from evil spirits with herbs or markings. Food preparation involved not just practical concerns, but ritual ones to prevent contamination by malevolent forces. Illness might be treated with practical herbal remedies alongside protective charms, prayers, or rituals to drive away the demons believed to cause the disease. Entertainment, with a side of screaming. So how did people unwind after a long day of death, fear, and soup that might kill them? Well, public executions, the original live theater. Bear baiting? Don't ask. Puppet shows where the jokes were mostly fart noises and bad Latin. Dancing. Lots of awkward rhythmic hopping to flutes. Entertainment in the medieval world often blended the sacred and profane, the cruel and the communal. Religious festivals provided some of the most important entertainment opportunities, with church holy days allowing brief respites from labor. These celebrations were far from solemn affairs, Many included carnival elements where social norms were temporarily inverted, allowing peasants to mock nobility and even clergy under the protective guise of festival license. Seasonal festivals marked agricultural milestones and religious observances, offering rare opportunities for communal celebration. May Day festivities welcomed spring with maypole dances and the crowning of a May Queen. Midsummer celebrations centered around massive bonfires believed to provide magical protection. Harvest festivals combined Thanksgiving for successful crops with revelry before the difficult winter months. Public executions served multiple social functions beyond mere punishment. They reinforced the power of authorities while providing a macabre form of public entertainment. Execution days often took on a carnival atmosphere, with vendors selling food and drink to spectators who might travel considerable distances to witness particularly notorious criminals meet their end. The condemned's final speech, confessing sins, proclaiming innocence, or cursing enemies, provided dramatic entertainment and moral instruction. Animal sports combined entertainment with practical purposes in a society where animal husbandry was central to survival. Bear baiting, where chained bears fought packs of dogs in specially constructed arenas, served both as entertainment and as training for dogs used in hunting and protection. Bulls were similarly baited before slaughter, partly for spectacle and partly from the belief that the exertion improved the meat's quality. These blood sports attracted audiences from all social classes, with aristocrats and commoners alike wagering on outcomes. There was music, yes, usually played by someone missing at least 3 teeth. There was drinking, heavily, frequently, and with suspicious liquids. There were festivals, chaotic, muddy, and sometimes full of fire. Taverns served as essential community centers, offering not just ale and wine, but news, gossip, and entertainment. Traveling minstrels might perform ballads recounting historical events or romances, preserving cultural memory while providing diversion. Professional storytellers carried tales between communities, adapting their repertoires to local tastes and current events. Board games provided portable entertainment and gambling opportunities. Chess, arriving in Europe through Islamic Spain, enjoyed popularity among the nobility, while simpler games like Nine Men's Morris, carved into tavern tables and church benches alike, crossed class boundaries. Dice games, despite periodic prohibitions from both secular and religious authorities, remained wildly popular, offering the tantalizing possibility of improving one's fortunes through luck rather than labor. Children's games reflected adult activities while building skills needed for later life. Boys practiced with miniature weapons and mock battles. Girls learned household management through doll play. Many games, from tag to hide and seek, helped develop the physical abilities and spatial awareness needed for survival in a physically demanding world. For the nobility, tournaments evolved from genuinely dangerous military exercises to more theatrical events combining athletic competition with pageantry. Knights competed in jousts and melees before aristocratic audiences, with victors winning not just prizes but also potential political favor and marriage opportunities. These events functioned as displays of martial prowess, social networking opportunities, and romantic spectacles, often incorporating elaborate allegories and costumes. You didn't party to relax, you partied to forget, and maybe, just maybe, to feel human for a few hours before waking up sore and broke again. So yes, medieval civilization had its charm. If you like plague, public torture, and superstition strong enough to outlaw frogs, but at least everyone suffered together. The privilege of suffering less, noble life except the nobles. They suffered slightly less until someone like you came along. While peasants toiled in fields and urban workers labored in cramped workshops, the nobility enjoyed privileges that set them dramatically apart from common folk. Their lives, however, weren't without challenges and constraints of their own. The most obvious advantage of nobility was physical comfort. Stone castles and manor houses, while drafty and cold by modern standards, offered protection from the elements that peasant hovels couldn't match. Noble homes featured private chambers rather than communal sleeping spaces, allowing for at least some privacy in an era when this was a rare luxury. Their diet included meat, fresh fish, spiced wines, and imported delicacies that commoners might never taste in a lifetime. Nobility also enjoyed legal privileges that commoners could only dream of. When accused of crimes, nobles were typically tried by their peers rather than local magistrates. If convicted, their punishments were generally less physically brutal. A noble traitor might be beheaded rather than drawn and quartered. Even in legal disputes with commoners, the system heavily favored the aristocracy, with peasants' testimony often carrying less weight than a noble's word. Education represented another stark divide. While literacy rates among commoners were extremely low, noble children typically received education from private tutors, monastery schools, or eventually universities. Noble women often learned to read and write, manage household accounts, play musical instruments, and understand the complex etiquette necessary for their social role, skills that might remain entirely inaccessible to peasant women. Healthcare, primitive as it was, favored the wealthy as well. While the actual medical treatments available weren't necessarily more effective, nobles could afford the services of university-trained physicians rather than village healers. They could purchase expensive medicines containing exotic ingredients and maintain more sanitary living conditions with servants to remove waste and prepare clean food and water. However, noble life came with its own set of constraints and dangers. Arranged marriages were the norm, with political and economic alliances taking precedence over personal preference, especially for women. Noble children might be sent to serve in other households at young ages, creating important connections but separating families. The complex web of feudal obligations meant that nobles were always navigating potentially dangerous political waters, where a single misstep could result in loss of favor, lands, or even life. Warfare presented a particular risk for the nobility. While commoners might be conscripted as foot soldiers during conflicts, nobility were expected to lead forces personally. Knights and lords fought in the front lines, where their conspicuous armor and valuable ransoms made them prime targets. Many noble families saw male heirs wiped out in battle, causing inheritance crises and power struggles. The strict hierarchy within nobility created constant status anxiety, with elaborate codes of dress, speech, and behavior marking one's precise place in the social order. Maintaining appearances appropriate to one's rank could be financially ruinous, with expectations for hospitality, patronage, and display that strained even substantial incomes. Many nobles found themselves deeply in debt to moneylenders while desperately maintaining the facade of prosperity essential to their social standing. Perhaps most significantly, nobility couldn't escape the omnipresent threats of disease, famine, and natural disaster that affected medieval society as a whole. The Black Death swept through noble households just as it did peasant villages. Their superior nutrition might provide some resistance to illness, but medical treatments for the afflicted remained largely ineffective regardless of social status. The hidden world of medieval women. When discussing medieval society, the experiences of half the population, women, often remain in shadow. Their lives, constrained by both law and custom, varied dramatically by social class while sharing certain fundamental limitations. For peasant women, daily life centered around unrelenting labor. Beyond the domestic duties of cooking, cleaning, and childcare, they participated actively in agricultural work, planting, harvesting, tending livestock, and processing food. Many practiced essential crafts like brewing, weaving, and cheese-making, which provided both household necessities and potential market goods. During harvest times, entire families worked from dawn until dusk, with women's labor considered economically essential rather than supplementary. Urban women in merchant or artisan households often participated directly in family businesses. While formal guild membership was typically restricted to men, widows sometimes inherited workshop rights, continuing businesses after their husbands' deaths. Women dominated certain trades, particularly textile production, brewing, before it became commercially profitable and shifted to male control, and food preparation. In towns, women could sometimes achieve a degree of economic independence impossible in rural settings. Noble women enjoyed material comforts but faced different constraints. They received better education than their lower-class counterparts, learning to read, write, and manage estates. When their husbands were away, a common occurrence during times of war, pilgrimage, or political duties, noble women often administered vast properties, overseeing agriculture, justice, and defense. Despite this responsibility, they remained legally subordinate, with their authority ultimately derived from male relatives rather than held in their own right. Across all social classes, women's lives were profoundly shaped by childbearing. With limited birth control options, mostly herbal methods of uncertain effectiveness and periodic abstinence, pregnancy was a frequent and dangerous state. Childbirth represented one of the leading causes of female mortality, with many women dying before age 30 from complications of pregnancy and delivery. Those who survived often endured a dozen or more pregnancies, only to see many children die in infancy. Religious life offered some women an alternative path. Convents provided education, community, and often significant autonomy, particularly for abbesses who might control substantial properties and wield considerable influence. However, this option was primarily available to women from wealthy families who could provide the necessary dowry for entry into prestigious religious houses. By the late medieval period, mysticism offered another religious avenue, with some women gaining recognition and limited authority through visionary experiences and writings. Legal systems throughout medieval Europe generally classified women as perpetual minors, always under the guardianship of father, husband, or son. They could not independently own property in many regions, testify in court on the same terms as men, or participate in formal political structures. While there were exceptions and regional variations to these limitations, the overall pattern remained one of systematic legal disability. Despite these constraints, historical records reveal women who found ways to exercise agency within the system's confines. Female merchants conducted independent business, female healers practiced medicine, and female mystics advised kings. Evidence from court records shows women actively defending their interests, using available legal avenues despite their limitations, and sometimes engaging in creative interpretation of the rules that bound them. The complex reality, beyond modern imagination. Our modern view of the medieval world often vacillates between two extremes: romanticized fantasy of chivalrous knights and fair maidens, or simplistic horror stories of unrelenting brutality and ignorance. The reality, as always, proves far more complex and nuanced. Medieval people weren't fundamentally different from us in their emotional and psychological makeup. They loved their children, mourned their dead, sought meaning and beauty in their lives, and adapted to their circumstances with remarkable resilience. They weren't passive victims of history, but active participants in communities with sophisticated social structures, technological innovation, artistic expression, and philosophical discourse. The medieval period wasn't static. It encompassed 1,000 years of European history, during which institutions, technologies, and cultural attitudes evolved considerably. The early medieval world, after Rome's collapse, differed dramatically from the urbanized, connected Europe of the 14th century. Geographic variations were equally significant, with Mediterranean regions experiencing very different conditions than Scandinavia or the Baltic. Recognizing this complexity doesn't require romanticizing a past that was, by our standards, often brutal and unjust. Average life expectancy hovered around 30 years, though this figure is somewhat misleading due to high infant mortality. Those who survived childhood might reasonably hope to reach their 50s or 60s. Hunger was a constant companion for many, with malnutrition weakening bodies against the onslaught of infectious disease. Violence permeated daily life in forms both structured and chaotic. Beyond formal warfare, banditry made travel dangerous, and local feuds could erupt into generational blood conflicts. Legal systems offered limited protection to the vulnerable, particularly those without powerful advocates or financial resources. Yet within this challenging reality, people created communities, relationships, and meaning. Village life, while materially impoverished, offered social connections largely absent in modern atomized societies. Artisans took pride in craftsmanship, creating objects of beauty that transcended mere utility. Intellectual life flourished in universities and monasteries, preserving and expanding knowledge despite technological limitations. This more nuanced understanding reveals a medieval world neither as romantic as fantasy novels portray, nor as unrelentingly grim as popular culture often suggests. It was simply human, complex, contradictory, and occupied by people who, like us, did their best to navigate the circumstances of their birth with the tools available to them. For the medieval assassin, this complex social tapestry provided both challenges and opportunities. The rigid hierarchies created grievances that powerful individuals might seek to resolve through clandestine means. The limitations of legal systems meant that assassins sometimes served as unofficial instruments of justice when formal channels failed. The anonymous nature of crowded cities allowed operatives to disappear among the masses, while the predictable patterns of noble life created vulnerabilities that could be exploited. In a world where life was uncertain and often brutally short, assassins were simply one more manifestation of the period's fundamental precariousness, a reminder that even those at the top of the social pyramid weren't immune to the fragility of human existence. Chapter 4. A brief history of horrible events. Because nothing says sleep well like plague and political backstabbing. Tonight, let's take a slow, slightly grim walk through some of the actual highlights of the medieval world. Not the heroic kind with banners and victory songs, the other kind. The ones with famine, betrayal, bad weather, and deeply questionable decisions by men in fancy hats. We won't get too detailed. You're supposed to be drifting off, not studying for an exam. But if you find yourself dozing somewhere between the third famine and the second rebellion, that's perfectly fine. Let's begin. The Black Death, 1347, 1351. If you were around in the mid-14th century, congratulations. You were statistically unlikely to survive. The Black Death wasn't just a plague, it was the plague. Killed around a third of Europe, give or take a few million. People dropped in streets. Families vanished in days. Entire towns went silent. There were so many bodies, they ran out of places to bury them. And when people didn't understand what caused it, they turned to the usual suspects: God, foreigners, and of course, cats, which they started killing, which made the rat problem worse, which didn't help. If you were an assassin during the plague, you either had more work or none at all. Hard to say. On the one hand, everyone was dying anyway. On the other, who needs a killer when the air itself is already handling it? The story of Europe's most devastating pandemic begins innocuously enough in October 1347, when 12 Genoese trading ships from the Black Sea docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. The people gathering on the docks to greet them were met with a horrific sight. Most sailors aboard were already dead, and the few survivors were gravely ill, covered in mysterious black boils that oozed blood and pus. Sicilian authorities hastily ordered the fleet out of the harbor, but their efforts were futile. The Black Death had arrived in Europe, and over the next 4 years it would kill more people proportionately than any other disease outbreak in human history. What exactly was this terrifying disease? Modern science has identified the culprit as Yersinia pestis, a bacterium carried by fleas that typically live on black rats. When infected fleas bit humans, they transmitted the disease, which could manifest in several forms. The most common was bubonic plague, characterized by the swollen, painful lymph nodes, buboes, in the groin, neck, or armpits that gave the pandemic its name. These buboes could grow as large as apples, turning black as they filled with pus and blood. Victims typically died within 7 days of infection. Even more terrifying was pneumonic plague, where the infection spread to the lungs, allowing the disease to transmit directly between humans through coughing and sneezing. This form killed even faster, sometimes within 24 hours. The rarest and deadliest variant, septicemic plague, attacked the bloodstream directly, sometimes killing victims so quickly they would go to bed feeling healthy and never wake up. Medieval people, of course, had no understanding of bacteria, fleas, or infection vectors. Their explanations ranged from miasma, bad air, to astrological alignments to divine punishment for sins. Some blamed poisoned wells, which tragically led to persecution of marginalized groups, especially Jewish communities, who were accused of conspiring to spread the disease. Tens of thousands of Jews were massacred across Europe, with entire communities burned alive in their homes or synagogues. The speed of the plague spread was breathtaking. From Sicily it moved to the Italian mainland by January 1348, reached France and Spain by summer, and arrived in England by autumn. By 1349, it had penetrated deep into Germany, Scandinavia, and Eastern Europe. No corner of the continent escaped. Medical responses were woefully inadequate. Physicians, working with theories derived from Hippocrates and Galen, focused on balancing the humors through bloodletting, which only weakened already suffering patients. Others prescribed aromatic herbs, believing they would purify the corrupt air. Some doctors recommended drinking gold particles dissolved in water or applying mixtures of herbs, animal excrement, or ground minerals directly to the buboes, treatments that were useless at best and actively harmful at worst. Many physicians refused to visit the infected, while others covered themselves in head-to-toe leather garments and wore bizarre beaked masks filled with herbs, believing these would filter out the disease. These plague doctors became an iconic and terrifying symbol of the pandemic. The scale of mortality is difficult to comprehend, even today. Contemporary chroniclers described apocalyptic scenes. Mass graves so hastily dug that hands and feet protruded from the soil, bodies piled in streets, houses full of corpses sealed and marked with crosses, entire villages completely depopulated. In Florence, the writer Giovanni Boccaccio witnessed the catastrophe firsthand and described how one citizen avoided another, how the father abandoned the child, and the brother his brother, and the sister her brother, and how wives abandoned their husbands. And, even worse, almost unbelievable, how fathers and mothers avoided visiting and tending their children. Statistical estimates suggest approximately 25 million Europeans died, between 30 to 50% of the total population. Some regions suffered even worse losses. Florence lost 60% of its inhabitants, Paris half. In England, nearly 1,300 villages simply ceased to exist as survivors fled to other areas. Society began to break down in the hardest-hit regions. Courts stopped functioning because judges died. Food became scarce as farmers perished in their fields. Churches stood empty as priests succumbed while administering last rites. University-trained physicians died in such numbers that standards for medical training declined for generations afterward. the psychological impact was equally devastating. Many survivors experienced what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress and survivor's guilt. Some responded with increased religious devotion, including the flagellants, who whipped themselves bloody while traveling from town to town, believing self-punishment would appease God's wrath. Others took the opposite approach, embracing hedonism in what seemed like humanity's final days. Boccaccio's Decameron describes people who believed that to live temperately and avoid all excess would be the best defense against such a danger. Others thought that to drink freely and enjoy life, going from one tavern to another, or going about the house from one end to another drinking with abandon, would be the best preventative. For assassins and others living at society's margins, the plague created a world of both opportunity and extreme danger. Law enforcement collapsed in many areas, leaving crimes uninvestigated. Wealthy targets became more vulnerable as their bodyguards and servants died or fled. However, assassins themselves faced the same risk of infection as everyone else, perhaps greater, as their profession often required travel between infected areas. Some entrepreneurial killers likely pivoted to new services such as body disposal, a lucrative if grisly business, or property theft from abandoned homes. Others may have found employment with desperate survivors seeking to eliminate rivals for dwindling resources. A few unscrupulous types even posed as plague doctors, gaining access to homes under the pretext of treatment but actually seeking valuables to steal. When the initial wave of pestilence finally subsided around 1351, survivors emerged into a transformed world. The massive population loss created severe labor shortages, allowing surviving peasants to demand better wages and conditions. This accelerated the decline of feudalism as the old system of serfs bound to land became untenable, when workers could simply move elsewhere for better treatment. The plague's impact on religion was profound. The Church's inability to prevent or explain the catastrophe damaged its authority. Many clergy had died fulfilling their duties to the sick, creating a shortage of educated priests just when spiritual guidance was most needed. This vacuum was partially filled by lay religious movements, some of which developed ideas that would later contribute to the Reformation. The plague's psychological legacy lingered for generations in European art and literature. The danse macabre, or dance of death, became a common artistic motif, showing skeletons leading people from all walks of life, kings, priests, merchants, peasants, to the grave, emphasizing death's universality. A general preoccupation with mortality permeated European culture, reflected in tomb sculptures, poetry, and religious practices. Though the initial pandemic eventually subsided, plague continued to revisit Europe regularly over the next 3 centuries, with major outbreaks occurring approximately every 10-20 years in various regions. The disease remained endemic until the 1700s, when improvements in urban sanitation and changes in rat populations gradually reduced its impact. For those who survived the Black Death, the experience was transformative beyond description. As one Italian chronicler wrote, "And no bells tolled, and nobody wept no matter what his loss, because almost everyone expected death. People said and believed, this is the end of the world." The Anarchy, 1135-1153, no, not a punk band. This was a 19-year civil war in England because the king died without a clear heir, and apparently no one thought to make a backup plan. The result? Chaos. Nobles fighting nobles, towns sacked, castles built in a hurry, then abandoned. And for the average person, meaning not important, it just meant higher taxes, more burned villages, and absolutely zero sense of safety. It was called the Anarchy because the absolute disaster hadn't been invented as a historical term yet. To understand this lengthy catastrophe, we need to start with a shipwreck. On November 25th, 1120, a vessel called the White Ship sank in the English Channel. This wasn't just any maritime accident. It was arguably the most consequential shipwreck in English history. Among the approximately 300 people who drowned was William Adelin, the only legitimate son of King Henry I and heir to the English throne. William's death created an immediate succession crisis. Henry, a son of William the Conqueror who had ruled England since 1100, was suddenly without a male heir in a society deeply skeptical of female leadership. Though he remarried quickly, hoping for another son, no male children resulted from his second marriage. Faced with this predicament, Henry took the unprecedented step of naming his daughter, Empress Matilda, as his heir. Matilda had impressive credentials. She was the widow of the Holy Roman Emperor Heinrich V and was currently married to Geoffrey of Anjou, a powerful French noble. However, no woman had ever ruled England in her own right, and many nobles were uncomfortable with the prospect. Nevertheless, Henry made his barons swear fealty to Matilda multiple times between 1127 and 1131. Among those who took this oath was Henry's nephew, Stephen of Blois, son of the king's sister Adela. Stephen was well positioned at court and had benefited greatly from his uncle's patronage, receiving extensive lands and titles. When Henry I died on December 1st, 1135, Matilda was in Anjou with her husband. Seizing the opportunity, Stephen moved quickly. He raced to England, where he secured the support of the citizens of London, who held considerable political power. His brother Henry of Blois, the influential Bishop of Winchester, and several key barons. Stephen was crowned king at Westminster Abbey on December 22, 1135, before Matilda could even organize a response. Stephen's swift action presented the kingdom with a fait accompli, and initially many accepted his rule. He had several advantages. He was male, present in England rather than abroad, personally popular, and had the crucial backing of the church. Many nobles likely considered the oaths they had sworn to Matilda as forced promises to an unpopular choice, not binding commitments. The early years of Stephen's reign seemed promising. He issued a charter upholding the privileges of the church and the nobility, distributed royal lands generously to secure loyalty, and was known for his amiable personality, a sharp contrast to the stern, sometimes harsh, Henry I. However, beneath this apparent stability, problems were brewing. Stephen's position was immediately challenged from multiple directions. King David I of Scotland, Matilda's uncle, invaded northern England in 1136, ostensibly in support of his niece's claim, but primarily seeking territorial expansion. In Normandy, Matilda's husband Geoffrey launched campaigns to take control of Henry I's continental territories. Within England itself, individual barons began testing Stephen's authority, building unauthorized castles, a direct challenge to royal power, and seizing neighboring lands. Stephen's response to these challenges revealed a critical weakness: inconsistency. Sometimes he acted decisively, as when he successfully repelled the Scottish invasion. Other times, he showed excessive leniency, allowing rebellious barons to return to favor without serious consequences. This created a perception that disloyalty carried little risk, encouraging further challenges to his authority. The situation deteriorated sharply in 1139 when Matilda finally invaded England, accompanied by her half-brother Robert of Gloucester, one of the most powerful nobles in the kingdom. Landing in Sussex, they secured a base in the west of England, establishing a rival court and essentially creating two competing centers of royal authority. What followed was not a straightforward civil war with clear battle lines, but rather a complex, shifting conflict characterized by sieges, skirmishes, rapidly changing allegiances, and devastating raids on civilian populations. Contemporary chroniclers describe the period in apocalyptic terms. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle lamented that every man built castles and held them against the king, and they filled the whole land with these castles. They sorely burdened the unhappy people of the country with forced labor on the castles, and when the castles were built, they filled them with devils, and wicked men. The conflict reached a dramatic turning point in February 1141 at the Battle of Lincoln, where Stephen was captured by Matilda's forces. Imprisoned at Bristol, his cause seemed lost. Matilda was proclaimed Lady of the English, notably not Queen, reflecting medieval discomfort with female rulers, and prepared for her coronation at Westminster. However, Matilda's apparent victory unraveled spectacularly. Her arrogant behavior alienated potential supporters, most notably the citizens of London, who drove her from the city before she could be crowned. Meanwhile, Stephen's queen, also named Matilda, rallied his supporters and continued resistance. In September 1141, the tables turned again when the Empress's most important ally, Robert of Gloucester, was captured at the Battle of Winchester. An exchange of prisoners was arranged, returning Stephen to leadership of his faction. For the next decade, the war ground on without decisive resolution. The country effectively split into regions controlled by different factions. Stephen dominated the southeast, including London. Matilda held the southwest. Various semi-independent barons controlled other areas, often switching sides opportunistically. The Church, initially supportive of Stephen, became increasingly neutral, hoping primarily for peace rather than victory for either side. The human cost of this prolonged conflict was immense. While aristocrats schemed and fought, ordinary people suffered from lawlessness, economic disruption, and direct violence. Contemporary accounts describe horrific atrocities committed by soldiers from both sides and by independent mercenaries who exploited the chaos. Matthew Paris, a later chronicler, wrote that men said openly that Christ and his saints were asleep. The worst violence occurred from unlicensed castles built by local lords without royal permission. From these private fortifications, armed bands would terrorize the surrounding countryside, extorting protection money, stealing crops and livestock, and kidnapping people for ransom. These adulterine castles, potentially hundreds of them, represented the complete breakdown of royal authority and public order. For assassins operating during the anarchy, the chaos created both opportunity and complications. The breakdown of central authority meant fewer resources dedicated to investigating murders, particularly politically motivated ones. However, the constant shifting of alliances made it difficult to determine who might hire an assassin's services one day only to become an enemy the next. Some professional killers likely attached themselves to particular lords, providing specialized services in exchange for protection and payment, while others operated as freelancers, selling their skills to the highest bidder in an environment where assassination had become just another political tool. The war finally began to resolve in 1147 when Robert of Gloucester died, depriving Matilda of her most effective military commander and advisor. Without his support, her position weakened significantly, and in 1148 she reluctantly returned to Normandy, effectively abandoning her personal claim to the English throne. However, the conflict wasn't over. Matilda's son, Henry Fitz-Empress, later Henry II, had been gradually taking up his mother's cause. Born in 1133, Henry had grown into a formidable young man, intelligent, determined, and by 1150 Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou through inheritance and conquest. In 1152, he significantly strengthened his position by marrying Eleanor of Aquitaine, recently divorced from King Louis VII of France, adding her vast territories to his already substantial holdings. In January 1153, Henry invaded England with a small force. Though just 19 years old, he demonstrated remarkable political and military skill, gaining support from key nobles disillusioned with the endless conflict. After months of maneuvering and limited fighting, the two sides faced off at Wallingford in July 1153. But neither army had the appetite for a decisive battle. The deadlock broke when Stephen's son and heir Eustace died suddenly in August 1153. Eustace had been a hardliner opposed to compromise. His death removed a major obstacle to peace. Stephen, now aging and war-weary, was more amenable to a settlement, particularly one that would secure the position of his surviving son, William. In November 1153, Stephen and Henry agreed to the Treaty of Winchester, sometimes called the Treaty of Wallingford. This remarkable compromise established that Stephen would remain king for his lifetime, but Henry would succeed him upon his death. Stephen's son William would not inherit the throne, but would retain his family's considerable personal lands and titles. The treaty also included provisions for dismantling unauthorized castles and restoring property seized during the conflict. Stephen died less than a year later on October 25, 1154, and Henry II was crowned on December 19th, beginning the Plantagenet dynasty that would rule England for over 3 centuries. The anarchy's effects lingered long after peace was restored. The lengthy breakdown of central authority had allowed local powers, particularly barons with their private castles and armies, to establish a degree of independence unprecedented since the Norman conquest. Henry II would spend much of his reign reasserting royal control, demolishing unauthorized castles, reform the legal system, and rebuild the administrative mechanisms of government that had atrophied during the conflict. For ordinary people, the anarchy's legacy was primarily traumatic. An entire generation had grown up knowing nothing but conflict, lawlessness, and insecurity. Though the devastation wasn't uniformly distributed across England, some regions experienced relative stability, while others suffered repeated cycles of violence. The collective psychological impact was profound. The period entered popular memory as a cautionary tale about the horrors of disputed succession and weak leadership. The anarchy also had significant implications for gender in medieval politics. Matilda's failure to secure the throne, despite having the stronger hereditary claim, reinforced resistance to female rule in England. It would be nearly 400 years until Mary I in 1553 before England had an uncontested queen regnant. When Henry II's son John faced his own succession crisis in 1216, the exclusion of his daughter in favor of his 9-year-old son Henry III demonstrated how thoroughly the principle of male succession had been cemented, partly due to memories of the anarchy. For professional assassins, the end of the anarchy likely necessitated adaptation. The restoration of stronger central authority under Henry II meant more effective investigation and punishment of crimes, including murder. However, the continuing importance of powerful nobles in the post-anarchy landscape meant patronage networks remained crucial. Assassins who had formed reliable relationships with nobles who remained in favor under the new regime could transition from wartime operators to peacetime enforcers, handling sensitive matters discreetly for lords who preferred to maintain plausible deniability. The final, perhaps most telling assessment of the anarchy comes from the contemporary Peterborough Chronicle, which described Stephen's reign with stark simplicity. In the days of this king, there was nothing but strife, evil, and robbery, and so it lasted for 19 long winters while Stephen was king, till the land was destroyed by such doings, and men said openly that Christ and his saints slept. The Great Famine, 1315 to 1317. Before plague, there was hunger, lots of it. The Great Famine wasn't just a bad harvest or two. It was years of cold, wet weather that destroyed crops across all of northern Europe. First the rains came and didn't stop, then the floods, then the mud that couldn't be plowed. Then the livestock died. Then people started eating bark, grass, and each other. Yes, there were documented cases of cannibalism. When you're starving to death, ethical considerations tend to get fuzzy around the edges. The horror began in the spring of 1315, when Europe experienced rainfall of unprecedented intensity and duration. Contemporary chroniclers reported that it rained continuously from April to August, with barely a 3-day stretch without downpours. Fields became saturated, then flooded. Seeds rotted in the ground before they could germinate. The few crops that did grow were often afflicted with fungal diseases that thrived in the damp conditions. Modern climatologists now understand this wasn't simply bad weather, but the beginning of the Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling that affected Europe for centuries. The immediate trigger appears to have been a major shift in North Atlantic weather patterns that brought relentlessly wet, cold conditions to Europe. This climatic shock hit a vulnerable agricultural system already at its limits, supporting a European population that had grown substantially during the relatively warm and stable medieval warm period, roughly 950–1250 CE. The consequences were immediate and severe. The harvest of 1315 failed catastrophically across most of northern Europe. In England, wheat yields fell by at least 40% below average. Similar or worse failures occurred across France, Germany, the Low Countries, and Scandinavia. Only the Mediterranean regions were spared the worst effects. Initially, people survived by consuming their seed grain, the portion normally saved for planting the next year's crop. This short-term survival strategy created a vicious cycle that ensured the crisis would continue even if weather improved. As less grain was available for planting in 1316, food prices skyrocketed. Historical records show grain prices increasing 4 to 5-fold in many regions, putting basic sustenance beyond the reach of common people. As winter approached, the situation deteriorated further. With fodder crops also failing, farmers couldn't feed their livestock. Draft animals crucial for plowing horses and oxen starved or were slaughtered prematurely for food, decimating the breeding stock needed for recovery. Some desperate farmers killed their plow animals for immediate food, essentially destroying their livelihoods to survive another month. By spring 1316, social systems began breaking down in the hardest-hit areas. Crime soared as desperate people stole food. Rural workers abandoned their fields and flocked to cities seeking charity, only to find urban populations equally desperate. Chroniclers report parents abandoning children they couldn't feed, and in extreme cases, horrors almost unimaginable: infanticide, grave robbing for food, and isolated but well-documented instances of cannibalism. A contemporary chronicler from the French region of Flanders wrote, "Men and women went wandering over the land with their children in their arms, and falling from weakness, spattered the roads with their blood. The strong devoured the weak after cooking them. The elderly and very young died first, followed by the poor." Though reliable statistics are impossible, historians estimate that 10 to 15% of Northern Europe's population perished during these years, possibly as many as 7–8 million people. Urban areas were particularly hard hit, with mortality rates reaching 25% in some cities. In places like Ypres in Flanders, mass graves were dug outside city walls for the mounting dead. Weather conditions marginally improved in 1317, allowing for slightly better harvests. However, by this point the agricultural system had been so damaged, with fewer workers, draft animals, and seed grain, that recovery was slow and incomplete. Just as societies began stabilizing, a devastating cattle plague known as murrain swept through Europe from 1319 to 1320, killing up to 80% of animals in some regions and preventing dairy production critical for nutrition. The combined disasters left a generation malnourished, stunted, and vulnerable to the greater catastrophe that would follow a few decades later, the Black Death. Some historians argue that the famine's long-term physical weakening of the population contributed to the plague's unusually high mortality rate when it arrived in 1347. For assassins and other marginalized individuals, the Great Famine created a transformed operational landscape. With law enforcement weakened and societal norms fraying, criminal activities faced fewer institutional obstacles. However, targets had far less wealth to plunder, and distinguishing murder from starvation death became increasingly difficult, potentially an advantage for those wishing their victims' deaths to appear natural. Some records suggest that mercenaries, outlaws, and others living at society's edges actually suffered higher mortality than settled peasants, having no land base to produce even meager crops. Others adapted by forming or joining armed bands that effectively controlled food distribution in certain areas, extracting protection payments from already desperate communities. The Great Famine fundamentally altered how medieval people viewed their world. The Church's authority suffered as prayers and processions failed to bring divine relief. Communities became more inward-looking and suspicious of outsiders who might compete for scarce resources. A general sense of apocalyptic dread pervaded European culture in the famine's aftermath, reflected in the dark, macabre art of the period that increasingly featured death imagery. When we consider the string of catastrophes that defined the 14th century, the Great Famine, followed by the Black Death, followed by renewed warfare, it becomes clearer why medieval people often viewed their era as one of divine punishment and the literal end of the world. For those attempting to survive by any means necessary, including selling their deadly skills to the highest bidder, this apocalyptic atmosphere provided both opportunity and an ethical framework that justified extreme measures in desperate times. Sweet dreams. If you've managed to stay awake through these cheerful bedtime tales of plague, civil war, and starvation, congratulations. You're either fascinated by human misery or have developed an impressive resistance to historical horror stories. For the assassination curious among you, these grim chapters of medieval life hopefully provide some context for the world in which your historical counterparts operated. It wasn't just that these professional killers were particularly ruthless individuals, though many surely were. They existed within societies repeatedly traumatized by catastrophes beyond comprehension, where death was a daily companion, political stability the exception rather than the rule, and survival itself required a certain moral flexibility. In a world where plague could eliminate half your town in a season, where armies might descend on your village without warning during civil conflicts, or where climate shifts could condemn entire regions to slow starvation, the ethical calculations around killing for profit necessarily shifted. The distance between an assassin's deliberately caused death and the countless natural deaths surrounding them narrowed considerably. This doesn't excuse the profession's obvious moral problems, but it does contextualize why assassination became an established, almost institutionalized practice in medieval power structures. When death was omnipresent and often arbitrary, controlling exactly who died, when, and how represented a form of power in otherwise chaotic circumstances. So as you drift toward sleep in your comfortable, plague-free, politically stable bedroom with its full pantry just steps away, perhaps spare a thought for your medieval ancestors. They endured unimaginable hardships that shaped the world we inherited, including its darker corners where assassination evolved from desperate survival tactic to refined professional service. The 100 Years' War, 1337 to 1453, expanded. A war that lasted, give or take, 116 years. England versus France. Over a crown, or a claim to a crown, or someone's cousin who married badly. It's complicated. There were heroes, sure. Joan of Arc shows up, but mostly it was decades of marching, raiding, muddy battles, and confused archers shooting at each other in fog. For assassins, wars like this were a mixed bag. More opportunities, more travel, more risk of being mistaken for a spy and tied to something on fire. What makes the Hundred Years' War particularly fascinating isn't just its extraordinary length, but how thoroughly it transformed both kingdoms involved. This wasn't one continuous conflict, but rather a series of campaigns punctuated by treaties, truces, plagues, and periods where everyone just went home for a few years to recover before starting the mayhem all over again. The whole mess began with a succession crisis. When French King Charles VI died in 1328 without a direct male heir, his cousin Philip of Valois took the throne as Philip VI. However, Edward III of England had a claim through his mother Isabella, Charles's sister. Initially, Edward accepted the situation and even paid homage to Philip as his feudal overlord for the lands England still held in France. But by 1337 relations had soured, and Edward formally claimed the French crown for himself. The legal arguments behind Edward's claim were complex, centered around whether a woman could transmit a right she couldn't personally exercise due to France's Salic law prohibiting female succession. But the real reasons were more practical. The French kings had been slowly nibbling away at English holdings in France for generations. Edward's territories in Gascony remained vulnerable to French interference. And there was the problem of Flanders, England's crucial trading partner, which increasingly found itself under French pressure. What followed was a conflict that would span 5 generations of kings and fundamentally reshape European warfare. The early phase brought stunning English victories at Crécy, 1346, and Poitiers, 1356, where English and Welsh longbowmen decimated the French cavalry charges. At Poitiers, the French King John II was even captured, forcing France to pay a crippling ransom for his return. The Battle of Crécy deserves special attention, as it marked the beginning of the end for the armored knight as the supreme force on the battlefield. The French approached with confidence, their heavy cavalry the pride of European warfare. What they encountered was something new. Disciplined formations of longbowmen who could launch arrows capable of piercing armor at a rate of 12 per minute. One contemporary chronicler described the sound of arrows striking armor as like rain falling on a slate roof. By day's end, the flower of French chivalry lay dead in the mud, and Edward's teenage son, the Black Prince, had earned his military reputation. For professional assassins operating during this period, the chaos provided both opportunities and hazards. With military forces stretched thin across 2 kingdoms, security was often lax in areas not directly experiencing fighting. Nobles from both sides frequently sought deniable ways to eliminate rivals or gain advantage, creating a steady market for discreet killings. Conversely, the heightened suspicion of outsiders meant that traveling assassins risked being detained as spies or enemy agents, particularly during periods of active campaigning. Interestingly, the war created a new class of operatives, individuals with military training who found themselves unemployed during truces and turned to assassination as a lucrative alternative. These weren't the refined poisoners of Italian courts, but practical men who understood how to make a murder look like a robbery gone wrong or a drunken tavern brawl. Their methods were as direct as their battlefield tactics, efficient, brutal, and leaving little room for error. The mid-phase of the war brought a remarkable French resurgence under Charles V, who avoided pitched battles in favor of what we'd now call guerrilla tactics. By the time of his death in 1380, most English gains had been reversed. Then came decades of relative quiet as both countries dealt with internal problems, peasant revolts, plagues, royal madness, and the like. The war's curious middle period also saw the rise of the infamous Free Company's bands of mercenaries who, finding themselves without employment between campaigns, turned to pillaging the French countryside. Men like the Englishman Sir John Hawkwood led these companies with military precision, effectively creating private armies that sold their services to the highest bidder, or simply took what they wanted when no one was hiring. Some free company captains became so powerful that kings and popes negotiated with them directly. For those in the shadow profession, these companies offered both competition, when they turned to extortion and ransom, and opportunity, when they needed more subtle problems solved. The Black Death, which first ravaged Europe from 1347 to 1351, killed perhaps a third of both countries' populations and temporarily slowed the conflict. But it also accelerated social changes that would have profound long-term effects. Labor shortages increased the power of common people, weakening feudal bonds. Taxation to fund the war sparked rebellions on both sides of the Channel. And as traditional hierarchies faltered, the way was paved for new concepts of nationhood that would outlast the war itself. The final phase began with Henry V of England's campaign in 1415, culminating in the famous English victory at Agincourt, where once again English archers demolished French forces several times their size. Under the subsequent Treaty of Troyes in 1420, the mad French king Charles VI disinherited his own son in favor of Henry V, who would marry Charles's daughter Catherine and eventually inherit both crowns. Agincourt itself has become legend, immortalized by Shakespeare's Band of Brothers speech. The reality was mud, exhaustion, and slaughter. The English, outnumbered and suffering from dysentery after a grueling march, faced a French army that should have crushed them. Instead, the French cavalry charged across waterlogged ground, becoming mired in the mud, while English archers fired with devastating effect. When the battle turned to hand-to-hand fighting, the cramped conditions actually favored the English, as French numbers became a liability in the press of bodies. The most controversial moment came when Henry, fearing a counterattack, ordered the execution of thousands of French prisoners, a grim calculus of war that shocked contemporaries, despite the brutal standards of the time. But history had other plans. Henry V died unexpectedly in 1422, leaving his infant son Henry VI as king of both realms, at least on paper. The French rallied behind Charles VI's disinherited son, now Charles VII, setting the stage for the most famous episode of the entire war, the rise of Joan of Arc. This remarkable peasant girl, claiming divine guidance, convinced the uncrowned Charles VII to give her troops to relieve the besieged city of Orléans in 1429. Against all odds, she succeeded, turning the tide of the war. Though she was captured and burned at the stake by the English in 1431, her brief military career had revitalized French national identity and morale. Joan's story is all the more extraordinary for the precision with which it can be documented. The transcripts of her trial survive, allowing us to hear her actual voice across the centuries. Her responses to her inquisitors reveal extraordinary intelligence and presence of mind. When asked if she knew she was in God's grace, she replied with subtle theological precision, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." The question was a trap. Catholic doctrine held that no one could be certain of being in God's grace, but Joan navigated it perfectly. For assassins of the period, Joan presented a unique professional challenge. Her sudden appearance and meteoric rise created the kind of disruption that often generated contracts for elimination. Yet her celebrity and constant presence among troops made traditional approaches nearly impossible. In the end, it wasn't an assassin's blade that ended her journey, but capture in battle and a politically motivated trial. This pattern, where high-profile targets ultimately fall to public rather than clandestine mechanisms, would repeat throughout history, reminding practitioners of the shadow arts that some figures simply generate too much attention for their traditional methods. The French slowly pushed the English back, and by 1453, only the port of Calais remained in English hands. The war petered out without a formal peace treaty. Everyone was simply too exhausted to continue. The long conflict left France devastated but nationally unified, while England, having spent enormous resources on a failed continental adventure, soon plunged into its own dynastic civil war, the Wars of the Roses. For the common people caught in between, the war brought unprecedented suffering. French peasants endured systematic chevauchées, deliberate English campaigns of destruction targeting civilians, burning villages, destroying crops, and slaughtering livestock to deny resources to the French crown. Mercenary companies roamed the countryside during truces, pillaging and extorting protection money from already impoverished communities. Between war, famine, and plague, France's population dropped by an estimated 50% during this period. The psychological impact was perhaps even more profound. Chronicles from the period describe peasants hiding in forests and caves, abandoning villages at the first rumor of approaching soldiers. Children grew to adulthood never knowing peace. Religious practices took on apocalyptic overtones, with flagellant movements and millennial cults gaining followers as traditional structures of meaning collapsed. The famous danse macabre motif in art, where death leads people from all social classes in a dance to the grave, originated during this period, reflecting a society traumatized by constant proximity to mortality. Even the nature of warfare changed. Knights and chivalry gradually gave way to professional soldiers and gunpowder weapons. The longbow, England's secret weapon in the early battles, was eventually superseded by early firearms and cannons. By the end of the conflict, medieval warfare had evolved into something recognizably more modern. The war also accelerated technological development in unexpected ways. Improved metallurgy, originally driven by the need for better armor against longbows, found applications in early printing presses and mechanical devices. Gunpowder, initially just a terrifying battlefield novelty, evolved into increasingly sophisticated weapons that would eventually render castle walls obsolete. Even the assassin's toolkit evolved, as expanding trade networks brought exotic poisons from the East, and new mechanical contrivances offered novel methods of elimination. For an assassin working through this chaotic century, adaptation was crucial. The introduction of plate armor meant traditional killing methods needed to evolve, targeting gaps in protection or abandoning direct confrontation in favor of poison or ambush. The increased movement of troops and supplies provided cover for travel, but also brought highway robbery and indiscriminate violence. Throughout the conflict, the most successful operators were those who could navigate this volatile environment while maintaining the anonymity essential to their trade. Perhaps the war's most enduring legacy was the birth of national consciousness on both sides. At the beginning, loyalty was personal, to one's immediate lord or king. By the end, people spoke of fighting for France or England as entities that transcended any individual monarch. The chronicler Jean de Venette captured this shift when he wrote of the French peasants who took up arms against English raiders. They had no king to lead them, but their hearts were united in a common cause. This nascent nationalism would reshape European politics in centuries to come. As the long conflict finally faded, it left behind societies transformed in almost every aspect. Political structures, military tactics, social hierarchies, economic systems, and even languages had evolved. English, once the language of the conquered in post-1066 England, had emerged as the tongue of national identity, while French had become standardized around the dialect of Paris. For those who lived by the blade and poison cup, the war's end meant adaptation once again. Some found service with nobles fighting in the Wars of the Roses. Others followed military leaders to new conflicts in Italy and the Balkans. The most successful recognized that the new, more centralized states emerging from the war created different kinds of opportunities. More court intrigue, more diplomatic secrets worth killing for, more wealth concentrated in fewer hands. The trade would continue as it always had, finding the shadows in each new age. The Peasants' Revolt, 1381, expanded. Now this one's interesting. After being overtaxed into the dirt for years, English peasants finally snapped. They marched on London, armed with whatever they could find: scythes, sticks, and a lot of justified rage. For a moment, it looked like they might actually win. They demanded justice, lower taxes, an end to serfdom. Then their leader, Wat Tyler, was murdered during negotiations, and the rebellion sort of collapsed. The king promised reforms, then took them back the second everyone went home. Classic? The roots of the Peasants' Revolt lay in the aftermath of the Black Death, which had decimated Europe's population, but inadvertently improved the economic leverage of surviving workers. With labor suddenly scarce, peasants began demanding better wages and conditions, a development that alarmed the nobility. In response, England's government, dominated by landowners, passed the Statute of Laborers in 1351, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and restricting workers' mobility. What made this particularly galling was the stark contrast with the increasing luxury of the nobility. The late 14th century saw an explosion of conspicuous consumption among England's upper classes. New fashions included absurdly long-toed shoes, elaborately embroidered clothing that changed seasonally, and feasts of spectacular extravagance. All this ostentation was paraded before people who were legally prohibited from improving their own conditions despite their increased economic value. The resentment this generated was perfectly captured in the popular rhyme of the time: "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" This simmering resentment combined with the immediate spark of a deeply unpopular poll tax. This flat tax, the third in 4 years, required everyone over 15 to pay the same amount regardless of wealth, placing a disproportionate burden on the poor. The money was ostensibly needed to fund the ongoing 100 Years' War with France, a conflict that brought little benefit to ordinary people while imposing significant costs. The final trigger came in May 1381, when a tax collector arrived in Essex and encountered violent resistance. Soon, villages throughout southeastern England were in open revolt. The speed with which the rebellion spread revealed sophisticated networks of communication that authorities had never suspected existed. Within days, coordinated risings occurred across multiple counties, suggesting careful planning and organization. This challenges the traditional view of medieval peasants as isolated and parochial. In reality, markets, fairs, parish gatherings, and traveling workers had created invisible webs of information exchange that could rapidly mobilize when conditions demanded. The rebellion's leadership included figures from various backgrounds. Wat Tyler, about whom little is known before the revolt, emerged as the primary military leader. John Ball, a radical priest who had been imprisoned for preaching social equality, provided ideological inspiration with his famous question, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" Their message of equality resonated with common people who had long endured legal and economic discrimination under the feudal system. Particularly notable was the participation of what we might call the middle class of the time: small landholders, craftsmen, village officials, and even some minor gentry. This wasn't simply a rising of the poorest against the rich, but rather a broad coalition united by frustration with a system increasingly seen as exploitative and unjust. Even some parish priests, themselves often from humble backgrounds, supported or joined the rebels. The rebels' grievances extended beyond immediate economic concerns to fundamental questions about the structure of society. They targeted for destruction the manorial records that documented their servile status and obligations. They attacked lawyers, who were seen as manipulators of an incomprehensible legal system that invariably favored the powerful. And they demanded the elimination of serfdom itself, a radical restructuring of the social order that would have fundamentally altered medieval England. By mid-June, a massive force, contemporary estimates suggest up to 30,000 rebels, had marched on London, which they entered with minimal resistance as many city dwellers sympathized with their cause. The 14-year-old King Richard II took refuge in the Tower of London, but agreed to meet the rebels at Mile End on June 14th. There, he seemingly accepted their demands, which included the abolition of serfdom, free access to markets, fixed land rents, and a general pardon for all rebels. The young king's actions during the crisis reveal a remarkable political maturity, whether through courage, calculation, or desperation. His decision to personally meet with the rebels, against the advice of most counselors, temporarily diffused an explosive situation. His promise to address grievances bought crucial time, even if those promises would later be broken. This incident foreshadowed Richard's later ruling style, which would be marked by both bold personal initiative and a problematic relationship with the truth. However, while this meeting was occurring, another group of rebels entered the tower and executed several of the king's most hated advisors, including the Lord Chancellor and Lord Treasurer, both architects of the poll tax. They found Archbishop Simon Sudbury hiding in the Tower Chapel and dragged him to Tower Hill, where they beheaded him. The Archbishop's death was particularly symbolic. As both the spiritual leader of the English Church and the Lord Chancellor, he represented the fusion of religious and governmental power that many saw as corrupted. The executions exposed divisions within the rebel movement. Some had constitutional aims and hoped to reform the system by removing evil counselors while maintaining respect for the king himself, a common political concept in medieval thinking. Others harbored more radical visions of social transformation. This internal tension between reform and revolution would characterize many popular uprisings throughout history. The next day, Richard met rebels again at Smithfield, where negotiations quickly deteriorated. Wat Tyler reportedly behaved disrespectfully toward the king, demanding more radical changes. In the ensuing tension, the mayor of London, William Walworth, fatally stabbed Tyler. With thousands of rebels witnessing their leader's death, a potentially explosive situation developed. In a remarkable display of courage, the teenage Richard rode forward alone, declared himself their leader instead, and promised to address their grievances if they would disperse. The exact sequence of events at Smithfield remains contested. Some chronicles, written by authors sympathetic to the authorities, portray Tyler as drunk and deliberately provocative. Others suggest his death was a premeditated assassination, with Walworth and his men prepared to strike at the first opportunity. What's certain is that Tyler's killing marked the rebellion's turning point. Within hours, royal loyalists regained control of London, and within days, the wider revolt began to fragment. This brave, or perhaps reckless act temporarily diffused the crisis, allowing the government to regroup. Once the immediate threat passed, Richard's promises were revoked. Over the following weeks, royal forces systematically suppressed remaining resistance. Hundreds of rebels were executed, including John Ball, who was hanged, drawn, and quartered as a traitor. The judicial aftermath reveals much about medieval concepts of justice and social control. The king's initial general pardon was quickly replaced with commissions of trail baston, special courts with extraordinary powers to investigate and punish rebels. These courts imposed collective punishment on communities, levying heavy fines even on those not directly involved. The message was clear. Revolt would bring consequences not just for individuals but for entire villages and towns. While the revolt failed in its immediate objectives, the poll tax was withdrawn but serfdom continued and the feudal order remained intact. It represented a profound psychological shift. Common people had demonstrated they could organize effectively, articulate political demands, and pose a genuine threat to the established order. The notion that peasants should know their place had been fundamentally challenged. The revolt's aftermath accelerated social changes already underway. While serfdom wasn't abolished by royal decree as the rebels had demanded, its economic viability was increasingly questioned. Many landlords began converting labor services to money rents, finding it more practical than maintaining an increasingly restive servile workforce. By 1400, serfdom was in serious decline across much of England, though this owed more to economic evolution than to the rebellion's direct impact. For assassins and others living outside conventional society, the revolt created a temporary window where normal power structures were suspended. Criminal records show a significant decrease in prosecutions during the rebellion, not because crime decreased, but because law enforcement collapsed. Some outlaws likely joined the rebellion, seeing common cause with its aims or simply exploiting the chaos, while others found their services in demand from wealthy individuals suddenly concerned about personal security. The rebellion also had profound effects on English literature and thought. Writers like William Langland and Geoffrey Chaucer, while not directly addressing the revolt, explored themes of social justice and criticism of corruption that resonated with the rebels' concerns. The revolt entered popular memory as a moment when the established order trembled, inspiring later generations to question whether that order was truly divinely ordained or merely a human construction that could be challenged. Archaeological evidence adds dimension to our understanding of the revolt. Excavations of villages active in the rebellion show increased prosperity in the decades before 1381, supporting the theory that the rising wasn't born of desperate poverty, but of blocked aspirations. These communities had experienced economic improvement, but found their social and legal status lagging behind their material conditions, creating a dangerous gap between reality and expectation. The uprising stands as one of history's most significant popular rebellions and foreshadowed later struggles for social equality. Though unsuccessful in the short term, many historians see it as an important step in the gradual decline of feudalism in England. It would be centuries before many of the rebels' demands were realized, but their brief moment of defiance left an indelible mark on England's social and political development. Perhaps the revolt's most enduring legacy is the question posed by John Ball, a fundamental challenge to hierarchical society that would echo through centuries of social struggle. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? This simple inquiry, questioning the natural basis of social inequality, remains as provocative today as when it was first asked on the fields of Kent in 1381. Assassinations that changed everything. Expanded assassins were rarely thanked, but sometimes they did change the course of history, usually in the most chaotic way possible. Like when Philip of Macedon, father of Alexander the Great, was killed at a public wedding celebration by a bodyguard with a grudge. Or when Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was murdered in his own cathedral in 1170, allegedly because the king sort of implied he wanted it done. Or when William the Silent, a Dutch leader, was shot by someone pretending to be his friend, and that assassin became the first person in history to be killed with a handgun. Congratulations, history. Of course, for every famous assassination, there were 100 that didn't make the scrolls. Because real killers weren't remembered, they were erased. That's the point, after all. You don't make statues of the shadow behind the throne. You just hope it doesn't come back for you. The shadow profession operates on the principle that the most successful operation is the one history never records. Yet paradoxically, some assassinations have shaped the course of civilization so profoundly that they cannot be erased from memory. These killings, where the identity of the assassin is known, but their impact extends far beyond the individual act, offer a window into how a single violent moment can redirect the currents of history. History pivots on singular, violent moments when one person's calculated action forever alters the course of nations. Perhaps no assassination better exemplifies this than the murder of Philip II of Macedon in 336 BCE. Philip had spent decades transforming Macedonia from a backwater kingdom into the dominant power in Greece, creating the formidable army that his son Alexander would later use to conquer much of the known world. The circumstances surrounding Philip's assassination read like a tangled web of court intrigue. The killing occurred during the public celebration of his daughter's wedding, a moment of apparent triumph as Philip had just arranged a favorable marriage alliance. The assassin, Pausanias, was one of Philip's own bodyguards, a young man who had previously been publicly humiliated after being sexually assaulted by Attalus, a powerful Macedonian general and the uncle of Philip's new young wife, Cleopatra. When Pausanias sought justice, Philip, unwilling to alienate Attalus at a sensitive political moment, offered the young man gifts instead of punishment for the offender. This perceived insult festered. On the day of the wedding celebrations, as Philip walked unprotected into the theater, Pausanias struck, stabbing the king with a Celtic dagger before attempting to escape to waiting horses. He tripped during his flight and was killed by pursuing guards, conveniently silencing forever the full story of his motivations and possible collaborators. The assassination's timing has led many historians to suspect a wider conspiracy. Philip's principal wife, Olympias, who had been displaced by the younger Cleopatra, had ample motive to remove Philip before he could potentially produce a more favorable heir with his new wife. The young Alexander, whose position as heir had similarly been thrown into question, also benefited immensely from his father's death. Ancient sources hint at their involvement, though definitive evidence remains elusive, exactly as would be expected in a well-executed conspiracy. For professional assassins observing this case, the most striking aspect would be the selection of Pausanias as the instrument. His personal grievance provided both motivation and, crucially, a self-contained explanation for the killing that would discourage deeper investigation. This represents a pattern repeated throughout history. The ideal assassin has their own apparent motive, disguising the hands of those who might have exploited that grievance for their own ends. Whatever the full truth, this single act of violence directly enabled Alexander's rise to power and his subsequent conquests across 3 continents. Had Philip lived to carry out his planned invasion of Persia himself, the course of ancient history might have unfolded entirely differently. Alexander's empire, though short-lived, spread Hellenistic culture throughout the ancient world, creating a common cultural language that would later facilitate the spread of Christianity and serve as a foundation for both Byzantine and Islamic civilizations. No less consequential was the murder of Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, in his own cathedral on December 29, 1170. Once a close friend of King Henry II of England and his trusted chancellor, Becket had transformed upon becoming archbishop, fiercely defending church privileges against royal authority. Their conflict escalated over years, culminating when Henry, frustrated beyond endurance, allegedly exclaimed, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" The exact words Henry spoke remain disputed, but their impact is not. 4 knights, Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard Le Breton, interpreted the king's outburst as a commission and departed immediately for Canterbury. They confronted Becket in the cathedral, demanding he submit to the king's authority. When he refused, their argument escalated to violence. As Becket knelt in prayer, the knights struck, slashing at his head so violently that one sword broke against the stone floor. According to eyewitnesses, Becket's spilled brains and blood stained the cathedral pavement, a desecration that shocked Christendom. The aftermath transformed both English politics and popular religion. Becket was canonized with unprecedented speed, becoming one of the most popular saints in medieval Europe. Pilgrims flocked to Canterbury, where many reported miraculous healings. The pilgrimage route became a major economic and cultural force, later immortalized in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Henry was forced into a humiliating public penance, walking barefoot through Canterbury while monks flogged him. From a professional perspective, the Becket assassination represents a cautionary tale about indirect commissioning. Henry's knights acted without explicit instructions, leaving the king in the difficult position of being held responsible for an action he may not have literally ordered. Throughout history, this pattern repeats. Unclear directives leading to excessive actions that backfire on their instigators. The most effective arrangements, by contrast, maintain clear communication while preserving deniability. The murder fundamentally altered the balance of power between church and state in medieval England, strengthening ecclesiastical independence for centuries afterward. Henry's attempt to assert royal authority over the church had catastrophically backfired, limiting the power of English monarchs in ways that would shape constitutional development down to the present day. Even the location of Becket's murder, the cathedral floor where his blood spilled, became a physical reminder of limits on royal power, visited by pilgrims and kings alike. The assassination of William the Silent in 1584 marked another pivotal moment in European history. As leader of the Dutch revolt against Spanish rule, William had been instrumental in establishing the independence of the United Provinces, later the Netherlands. After multiple failed attempts on his life, he was finally killed by Balthazar Gerard, who gained access to William by posing as a French Protestant sympathizer. The planning behind this assassination demonstrates a level of sophistication that professional killers would recognize. Gerard spent months establishing his cover identity, presenting himself as a Protestant refugee fleeing persecution. He carried forged letters of introduction and displayed religious convictions that matched William's own Reformed beliefs. This careful preparation allowed him to penetrate William's inner circle and gain opportunities for close access. Gerard shot William at close range with a wheel-lock pistol loaded with 3 bullets, making this the first successful political assassination carried out with a firearm. The assassin was captured and subjected to horrific torture before execution, but the Spanish King Philip II, who had placed a bounty on William's head, later ennobled Gerard's family. The assassination's context reveals much about the evolution of the assassin's craft in early modern Europe. Philip II had issued a formal proclamation offering nobility and 25,000 crowns to anyone who eliminated William, essentially converting a traditional assassination contract into a matter of public policy. This represented a momentary transparency about practices that normally remained hidden, offering a rare window into the economics of political killing during this period. Rather than crushing the Dutch rebellion as intended, William's martyrdom galvanized Dutch resistance. His son Maurice continued the fight, eventually securing Dutch independence. The assassination thus contributed directly to the emergence of the Dutch Republic, which would become a major commercial and colonial power in the 17th century, helping to shape the global economic system. The killing also inadvertently promoted the development of modern security concepts. After William's death, other threatened leaders implemented new protective measures. The pistol, small, concealable, and capable of delivering lethal force without special training, transformed threat assessments. Guards began focusing on keeping unknown persons at a distance and checking for hidden weapons, developing protocols that would evolve into modern VIP protection practices. These famous cases reveal common patterns in history-altering assassinations. First, they often achieve the opposite of their intended effects. Becket became more powerful in death than life, and William's death strengthened rather than weakened Dutch resolve. Second, they frequently occur at moments of precarious balance, when the elimination of a single individual can tip historical scales. Finally, many leave ambiguous legacies that historians still debate centuries later. Less frequently discussed but equally significant was the assassination of Emperor Commodus on December 31st, 192 CE, which ended the Antonine dynasty and plunged the Roman Empire into civil war. Commodus, the son of the philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius, had proven increasingly unstable, renaming Rome Colonia Commodiana and presenting himself as Hercules reborn. After multiple failed plots, he was finally strangled in his bath by his wrestling partner Narcissus, following a conspiracy organized by his chamberlain, mistress, and the Praetorian prefect. This assassination, occurring at the turning point between the stable Five Good Emperors period and the chaotic military anarchy of the 3rd century, represents a crucial moment when Rome's trajectory toward decline accelerated. The subsequent year of the 5 emperors established the dangerous precedent that imperial power could be purchased from the Praetorian Guard or won through civil war, undermining the carefully constructed constitutional facade maintained by earlier emperors. For professional assassins, these high-profile killings represented both cautionary tales and business opportunities. The intense investigations that followed such murders made anonymity even more crucial for those in the trade. Conversely, the demonstration of assassination's power to reshape history ensured continued demand for such services from those seeking to force political change through violence. The most sophisticated practitioners developed techniques to create natural deaths that avoided scrutiny altogether. Ancient toxicologists became adept at concocting poisons that mimicked known diseases. The Romans were particularly skilled in this area. Rumors persist that Emperor Augustus's wife Livia employed such methods to ensure her son Tiberius's succession, eliminating potential rival heirs with symptoms resembling illness. Such techniques reached their highest development in Renaissance Italy, where families like the Borgias elevated poisoning to an art form. As you've noted, for every recorded assassination that entered historical memory, countless others went undocumented. Professional killings designed to leave minimal traces. The best assassins remained shadows, their identities and methods known only to their employers and targets. Their very success was measured by their absence from historical records, by deaths attributed to natural causes, accidents, or unknown assailants. Historical archives occasionally provide tantalizing glimpses of this shadow world. Venetian state records contain coded references to special services rendered to the Republic by individuals who received payment, but whose specific actions go unmentioned. The Ottoman Empire maintained similar records of payments to agents described merely as solving a problem for the Sultan. These bureaucratic breadcrumbs hint at a vast hidden infrastructure of political violence operating beneath the surface of official history. This historical amnesia served both the assassins and those who employed them. Masters of the craft knew that survival depended on obscurity, while powerful patrons maintained plausible deniability through layers of intermediaries. The assassination profession thus operated in a strange paradox, practicing an art whose greatest achievements were precisely those that history would never record. Perhaps this explains the enduring fascination with assassinations that do make the historical record. These failures and anomalies, killings too public or consequential to be erased, offer rare glimpses into a shadow world that has shaped history from the margins. Behind each documented case, one suspects countless successful operations that achieved their aims without leaving traces for historians to find. Like dark matter in the universe, invisible but massive in its effects, the accumulated impact of these unrecorded eliminations may have altered the course of civilization in ways we can never fully measure. All right, That's enough history for now. You've survived the plague, the wars, and at least 2 doomed uprisings. Not bad for someone lying under a blanket with a podcast app. Let's start winding things down. Next comes the part where we gently step back from history's loudest mistakes and remind ourselves that even in the worst of times, you still had to find somewhere dry to sleep. So here you are, still breathing, still listening, which means you've made it to the end of the quiet, grimy, slightly blood-stained journey that was the life of a medieval assassin. And look at you, alive, warm, horizontal, not currently hiding in a barrel or being chased through alleyways by someone with a sword and a personal grudge. That's progress. You've walked through shadowed hallways. You've stabbed metaphorically and occasionally literally through the myths of romance and honor. You've crawled through the mud, listened to dogs bark at the worst possible time, and discovered that poison isn't nearly as elegant as stories suggest. And most importantly, you've learned a simple truth. Being a medieval assassin was not about skill. Not really. It was about desperation. It was about surviving in a world that didn't care whether you lived, died, or vanished into the smoke. There were no heroes, no cinematic exits, no closing credits. Just cold floors, broken promises, and the quiet understanding that the more people who knew your name, the shorter your life became. And yet, there's something strangely peaceful in all that anonymity, isn't there? A kind of stillness in knowing that the world moved on whether you succeeded or failed, and that your legacy, if you had one at all, was a whisper. Maybe, if someone remembered to whisper. Now, as you lie there, hopefully somewhere between barely awake and deeply snoring, take a moment to appreciate your life as it is now: a soft blanket, a safe bed, a night without armed guards or noble betrayals. You're not hiding in a hayloft. You're not hoping your cloak makes you invisible. You're not pretending to be a monk named Brother Tobias just to survive the week. You're just resting. And in a world where rest used to be a luxury few could afford, that's kind of beautiful. If you enjoyed this slow tumble through the worst job of the Middle Ages, feel free to leave a quiet comment. Maybe something like, "Survived the shadows," or "Still better than tax season." It lets me know you made it, and that you're not just a ghost with earbuds. And if you enjoyed this slow descent into the grime of history, give it a like, maybe subscribe, and share it with someone who thinks they would have made a great assassin. Spoiler, they wouldn't. And if your eyes are still open, that's fine too. The good news is, no one's coming for you tonight. Sleep well, friend, and may your dreams be dagger-free.